So we're going to continue our studies of aerobic endurance training, and kind of next on the HIT list, and I use HIT, H-I-I-T. Next on our HIT list is the idea of interval training. So I've got a couple of images in here which, loosely speaking, might resemble some notion of aerobic interval training. But what I kind of want to do excuse me, straight away. So I want to sort of sketch a graph of what interval training might look like. So this is going to be somewhat of a freehand graph. Okay, so what we've got on the vertical is we have the idea of intensity. And of course, intensity in this case is going to be percentage of heart rate max. And on the horizontal, we've got the idea of time. And what we'd expect to see with interval training is that intensity goes from being low to higher, dropping down to low to higher, and so on. We get this kind of profile for interval training, okay? And I'm just sketching it in, but you get the idea. Okay, so it looks a little bit like this in terms of the intensity of the workload. Now, just bear in mind that this doesn't necessarily reflect our percentage of heart rate max, for example, which wouldn't react as immediately. This is just change of intensity. So a couple of things I'd like to address immediately about this. These lower points, these low intensity points here, 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 and here, they can be complete rest, okay, potentially. But they can also be walking, or we might describe it as light jogging. But personally, when I think about interval training, it's really focused on the idea of work, then followed by rest, and or what we might call relief. Okay, so we've got this idea of resting, walking, or light jogging within that particular point. Another term I'd really like to introduce to you is the idea, and we can see it very clearly in that very poor illustration I've made, about the training itself being intermittent. Okay, so we've got low intensity, higher intensity, lower intensity, higher intensity, and we describe this as intermittent training. In fact, intervals can be replaced by the word intermittent training, so it's a nice one for you to get to know. The other point I would like to make is that interval training is really controlled by the recovery period, controlled by recovery. So what we find here is that one of the development phases for us within within interval training is that, of course, once we've done this period of work here, it becomes really essential that we recover effectively and efficiently in this recovery period. So it really stresses our aerobic systems to recover rapidly, including the anaerobic work that we've actually done. So I want to talk a little bit about the intervals themselves. We would expect the intervals for aerobic conditioning to be as a minimum of 3 minutes plus. Okay, so 3 minutes plus for the work period, something like that. And there is a reason for that. I mean, effectively, we consider 3 minutes to be the baseline or the minimum period of time to elapse for us to consider work as aerobic. So 3 minutes minimum. We can also say sometimes that therefore means that's about 1,000 meters as for good quality athletes to be running. So 1,000 meter run minimum, and we might be talking about something like a 200 meter swim as a minimum work period with an aerobic interval. And generally speaking, again, I mean, we are talking about, and I think this figure should be much higher, we are talking about something greater than 60% of VO2 max. Okay, so we need to be working at an intensity which is over 60% of our maximum oxygen uptake of VO2 max, and therefore that's obviously within our work periods. Don't forget as well that in our recovery periods we're still working above resting VO2 max because we're actually recovering those anaerobic systems, and that's actually an interesting point. Another point, I'd like you to develop a knowledge of the language of work, relief, ratio. Okay, so how long is the work period to the rest period, the work to the rest or relief? And generally speaking, we'd expect it to be something like 1-to-1. So if we work for 3 minutes, we recover for 3 minutes. But the recovery can be much shorter than that, the way some people structure their interval training. Another point is that we often consider these kind of intervals to be what we call threshold training. When you say threshold training, we are working at the upper levels of our aerobic zone. So on that basis, we are touching into anaerobic conditioning as well, but really we're at the upper extreme end of our aerobic zone. Look, if we're going to go and run for 3 minutes, for example, we have to push ourselves within that 3 minutes to go really hard, and therefore it's a threshold. It's almost anaerobic, or quite some of the work at least is being done anaerobically. So a couple of things from me about advantages and disadvantages. So advantages first for this interval. We're saying that with interval training, it's pretty effective, okay? So it can be pretty effective. So it can cause adaptation is what we mean by that. The other point is it can be pretty varied. You know, we can change the number of reps, number of sets. We can change the length of the work period. We can change the intensity. So it is a relatively varied experience. We'd also say on the negative side is it can be, there can be some issues here of motivation, because you are working at higher intensities. Not all athletes are kind of willing to push themselves to those upper, or what we call threshold areas within their training. So that can be a bit of a kind of an issue. And the other point I'd make, because we're looking at aerobic, because we're looking at aerobic endurance, we're still looking at short work intervals. So for me, I would argue that these short work intervals need to also be combined, these sort of 3 minute or 1,000 meter run intervals. They need to be combined with in other training sessions with work which is more continuous to get that full kind of aerobic development. But certainly interval training is a very, 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 very good alternative or addition to combining this with, for example, continuous training and some weight and resistance training, which we've looked at previously, and it can be very effective. That's all from me. Thanks very much.